2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like that. And right down onto its footprint. You see, that's the goal of controlled demolition. You don't want the building to tip over, which is much easier to do with explosives, actually. Just knock out the supports and let her tip. The trusses in the building made it very asymmetrical. There were 24 central columns, steel columns. For those to fail in such a way that that building would collapse in the center first and then come straight down, instead of toppling over, for instance, no.
After years of questioning and activism by the family members of victims of September 11th, thousands of government contractors, engineers, architects, and other credentialed experts have joined together and examined the collapse of the Twin Towers and have looked into Building 7. A group now calling themselves Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth combines all of these professionals and has received virtually no coverage by the mainstream media. Although media has been invited to their events, as well as over 50 different disclosure attempts set up by the family members, marches by the so-called 9/11 truthers, and press conferences, the media remains silent. A media blackout has been in effect for years, and the small reporting done on the movement has been disproportionate, misrepresentative, or condescending. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth was started by Richard Gage, a 25-year professional architect of high-rise, steel-reinforced skyscrapers.
In order for the perimeter to fall perfectly and symmetrically, which it pretty much does at Building 7, all of those columns have to be removed within a tenth of a second of each other. Fire cannot do that.
Another structural engineer of the over 3,500 credentialed expert members that have joined his group says he can imagine 1 or 2 columns failing.
It is possible that you could have a local failure as a result of a connection failing. But the likelihood of that failure dragging the entire building in such a fashion that all the columns would fail at the same time is an impossibility.
The entire roofline cascades down neatly into its own footprint. At the same time, jets of debris can be seen shooting out of the walls and going up. NIST can simply declare, NIST has seen no evidence that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was caused by bombs, missiles, or controlled demolition.
In the FEMA report, I think they were fairly honest, and it's interesting as you read what they said about Building 7. So, I'm reading with great interest. At the end, they say, well, our best hypothesis, now, this is the fire and damage hypothesis. That's the only hypothesis they looked at, seriously. Okay, so our best hypothesis, they said, has only a low probability of occurrence. And I'm saying, that's right. That's exactly right. Why don't you quantify that? But they didn't quantify it. But they did admit, it has only a low probability of occurrence, and that's to their credit. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention Building 7 collapse,
The first column to collapse is column number 80, which was untouched by any structural damage. This is evident in the fall of the east penthouse, supported by column number 80. This precedes global collapse. But what happens next, several seconds later, is not so easily explained. Looking at photos of the building after its collapse, it is clear that the entire cage of interior columns failed. The structure piled into its own footprint. Shot at about 9 p.m. on September 11th. The U.S. Post Office is on the left. World Trade Center 7 stopped at the sidewalk along the post office. Building 7 was hundreds of yards away from the towers, across the street, while buildings 3 through 6 were in the immediate area under the falling debris. They received massive amounts of direct impact from the falling towers and maintained their integrity, and did not pancake. Objects do not increase momentum or inertia when they strike a force opposing them, but lose momentum and follow the path of least resistance, as is stated by the law of inertia. Building 7 housed the Office of Emergency Management, which was the office designed by Jerome Hauer to deal with New York during a terrorist attack.
From hurricanes and heat waves to bioterrorism, New York City is gearing up for the worst.
We've got PD, fire, EMS.
The emergency exercise was staged with local, state, and federal officials on hand
to help identify the source of the outbreak.
A hypothetical outbreak caused by a deadly biological agent had been released by unknown terrorists somewhere in New York City.
Tell them to expect notification from us. We may ask them to close the system.
It wasn't the first time New York City ran an exercise reacting to a potential crisis, but it was the first to be run out of the city's new $13 million high-tech emergency operations center.
The city is better prepared than it ever has been in its history.
The new facility is located in downtown Manhattan, across the street from the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. The command center on the 23rd floor is bulletproof and bomb-resistant, with its own air supply and generators. It's linked to city airports, the Coast Guard, and the Pentagon. Computers will soon have detailed blueprints of every major building in New York City, as well as evacuation routes. Hurricanes and heat waves would be handled here, as well as terrorist attacks.
Particularly when it comes to biological terrorism, no city is where we're at.
Shortly after the bombing of the World Trade Center, New York City scrapped its existing emergency plans and began writing new ones. A couple of years later, following the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, Congress passed a law calling for 120 of the nation's largest cities to be prepared for terrorist attacks.
I think New York City is very ready, very prepared.
Though New York officials say their facility is not impenetrable, they're confident it could handle even the worst crisis imaginable.
Also in that building, the New York offices of the U.S. Secret Service.
And has confirmed reports that the CIA had an undercover office in 7 World Trade Center. One of the buildings destroyed along with the Twin Towers September the 11th. A U.S. official tells CNN the office was involved in counterterrorism and counterintelligence. The official says no CIA employees were killed in the collapse.
Number 7 World Trade Center was also the New York office of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA ordered the building surrounded by FBI agents shortly after it collapsed.
It housed the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the joint FBI-CIA counterterrorism group that ironically tracked bin Laden. It was a spook house filled with intelligence officials. The building was over-designed to withstand serious structural damage, for it was used by the city for emergency response purposes in a terror attack. The tower was standing for about 7 hours until it came down. And when it did come down, it happened in 6.5 seconds. Now remember, buildings 3 through 6 were in the immediate area and received massive trauma. The Oklahoma City bombing showed the Murrah building was barely standing with a few core columns after it had